Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today with a message of power, of truth, and of hope. It is a message that speaks to every heart that has ever been wounded, to every soul that has ever faced opposition, to every believer who has ever wondered, what should I do about my enemies? The Bible tells us in Romans 12:19, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. My friends, God is not blind to the struggles you face. He sees the battles, the betrayals, the pain inflicted by others. But he tells us, let me handle it. One, the reality of enemies throughout history. The people of God have faced enemies. Jesus himself warned us in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. You see, it is no surprise that if you stand for righteousness, if you live by faith, if you follow Jesus, you will face resistance. People will try to bring you down. They will lie about you, betray you, and even seek to harm you. But the Lord says, do not fear. He is greater than any enemy you will ever face. Two biblical examples of God handling enemies. Look at the story of David and King Saul. Saul pursued David, sought to kill him, but David refused to lift his hand against Saul. And what happened? In the end, God removed Saul from his throne. Think of Moses and Pharaoh. Pharaoh enslaved God's people, but did Moses need to take revenge? No, God fought the battle. He sent the plagues. He parted the Red Sea and he drowned Pharaoh's army. Or take Jesus himself. He was betrayed, falsely accused, mocked, beaten, and crucified. Did he call down fire from heaven? No. He said, Father, forgive them. And what happened? 3 days later, he rose victorious. 3, God's justice versus human revenge. You and I often want immediate justice. When someone wrongs us, we want to strike back. But let me tell you something today, human revenge is weak. But God's justice is perfect. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what we do not know. And when we take matters into our own hands, we step outside of God's will. The book of Proverbs 20:22 says, do not say, I will repay evil, wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. 4, responding with faith, not fear. If you believe that God is fighting for you, then you don't have to fight for yourself. Faith means saying, Lord, I don't understand, but I trust you. It means resisting the urge to act in fear, anger, or bitterness. 5, love and forgiveness as spiritual weapons. Jesus didn't just tell us to tolerate our enemies, he commanded us to love them. In Matthew 5:44, he said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That is power, that is victory. You see, when you forgive, you release yourself from the prison of bitterness. And when you love, you leave room for God to work in ways you cannot imagine. 6, victory through surrender to God. The world tells you that victory is defeating your enemies. But God tells you that victory is trusting him to fight your battles. Victory is not revenge. Victory is faith. Victory is knowing that God's plan is greater than your pain. So today, my friend, I urge you, let go and let God handle your enemies. You don't have to carry the burden of revenge. You don't have to live in fear. You don't have to fight battles that belong to the Lord. Trust him. He is faithful. He is just. And in his perfect time, he will make all things right. May God bless you all. Enemies are a reality in life, and every believer at some point will face opposition. It is an unavoidable part of living in a fallen world. From the moment you commit to walking with God, there will be forces, both seen and unseen, that rise against you. These enemies may come in many forms. Some may be individuals who seek to harm you with their words or actions, while others may be spiritual attacks meant to weaken your faith, discourage you, or push you off course. Even Jesus warned us in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. This verse does not say that we might face trouble. It says we will face it. It is not a matter of if, but when. Think of the life of David. He was chosen by God, anointed to be king, yet before he could ascend to the throne, he faced relentless persecution from King Saul. Saul was jealous of David's success and favor with God, so he sought to kill him. Despite being given multiple opportunities to retaliate, David refused to harm Saul, trusting that God would handle the situation. And in the end, God did. Saul was removed and David took his rightful place as king. This teaches us an important lesson. When we are faced with enemies, our first instinct may be to fight back, to seek revenge, or to defend ourselves. But David's story reminds us that God sees everything and will act on our behalf in his perfect timing. Joseph's life also illustrates this truth. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned for years. If anyone had a reason to seek revenge, it was Joseph. Yet he remained faithful to God, and in due time he was elevated to a position of power in Egypt. When his brothers finally stood before him, trembling in fear, Joseph said in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." This is a powerful statement. What others meant for evil, God turned for good. Sometimes the enemies we face are merely tools in God's hands to shape us, to test our faith, and to prepare us for something greater. Even Jesus himself, the Son of God, had enemies. The religious leaders sought to discredit him. The crowds turned against him. One of his own disciples, Judas, betrayed him. And yet through all of this, Jesus never once sought to take revenge. Instead, he surrendered to the will of God, knowing that his suffering would lead to the greatest victory, the salvation of mankind. In life, there will be times when we feel overwhelmed by opposition, but we must remember that God is always in control. He allows challenges not to destroy us, but to strengthen us. He does not promise a life free from enemies, but he does promise to be with us through every battle. When we trust him, we can walk in peace, knowing that he will fight for us. Throughout the Bible, we see powerful examples of how God handled the enemies of his people. These stories remind us that we do not have to take matters into our own hands. Instead, we can trust that God sees every act of injustice, every betrayal, and every attack against his children. He is a righteous and just God, and he will always defend those who put their faith in him. One of the most well-known stories of God handling enemies is the account of Moses and Pharaoh. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, crying out for deliverance. Pharaoh, in his pride and stubbornness, refused to let them go, even after repeated warnings from Moses. But God was not blind to their suffering. He sent plague after plague upon Egypt, demonstrating his power and authority. Finally, after the devastating death of the firstborns, Pharaoh relented and let the Israelites go. But even then, his heart was hardened once more, and he pursued them with his army, seeking to destroy them at the Red Sea. At that moment, when it seemed as though there was no escape, God performed one of the greatest miracles in history. He parted the sea, allowing his people to walk through on dry land, and then caused the waters to collapse upon Pharaoh's army, wiping them out completely. The Israelites did not have to fight or seek revenge. God handled their enemy for them. God handled their enemy for them. Another remarkable example is found in the story of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. In 2 Chronicles 20, we read about how a vast army came against him, far too powerful for him to defeat. But instead of panicking or rushing into battle, Jehoshaphat did something extraordinary. He called the people to fast and pray. He sought the Lord, acknowledging that they had no power to stand against such a great enemy. And what did God do? He told them, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." 2 Chronicles 20:15. Then, instead of sending soldiers to the front lines, Jehoshaphat sent singers and worshipers praising God as they marched. And as they praised, the Lord caused the enemy armies to turn against each other, completely destroying themselves. Judah never had to lift a sword. God fought the battle for them. The ultimate example of God handling enemies is seen in the life of Jesus Christ. The religious leaders falsely accused him. Judas, one of his own disciples, betrayed him. The crowds that once cheered for him later shouted, "Crucify him!" And yet, Jesus never sought revenge. He did not call down angels to destroy his enemies. Instead, he entrusted himself fully to the will of God. Even as he hung on the cross, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. And in the greatest act of divine justice, God raised him from the dead, proving that no enemy, no attack, and no injustice can prevail over his power. These stories teach us that when we face enemies, we do not need to fight in our own strength. We can trust that God is our defender, and in his perfect time, he will bring justice. Human nature often urges us to seek revenge when we are wronged. The pain of betrayal, the sting of injustice, and the wounds inflicted by others can stir within us a deep desire to retaliate. We want to take matters into our own hands, to prove our strength, and to ensure that those who hurt us experience the same suffering. However, the Bible teaches a different path. It tells us that vengeance does not belong to us. It belongs to the Lord. His justice is not only perfect, but far greater than anything we could accomplish on our own. In Romans 12:19, we are given a direct command. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. This verse reminds us that when we try to take justice into our own hands, we are stepping outside of God's will. We are essentially telling God that we do not trust Him to handle our situation. But the truth is, God sees everything. He knows every detail, even the hidden motives of those who wrong us. His justice is not based on human emotions, but on divine wisdom. A powerful biblical example of this principle is found in the life of David. Before he became king, he was relentlessly pursued by King Saul, who was jealous of him and sought to kill him. On 2 occasions, David had the perfect opportunity to strike back and take Saul's life. His men even encouraged him to do so, saying that God had delivered Saul into his hands. But David refused. He recognized that taking revenge was not his responsibility. Instead, he chose to leave the matter in God's hands. And what happened? In time, God removed Saul from power, and David became king without ever having to resort to violence or vengeance. This teaches us that when we trust God's justice, we do not have to lower ourselves to the ways of the world. Another example comes from the story of Joseph. After being betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned, Joseph had every reason to seek revenge when he finally rose to power in Egypt. His brothers came before him, desperate and afraid, knowing that he had the authority to punish them. But instead of taking justice into his own hands, Joseph chose to trust God. He told them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. Joseph understood that God had used the very injustice he suffered to bring about a greater purpose. Jesus himself demonstrated this principle in the most powerful way. When he was falsely accused, beaten, mocked, and crucified, he did not retaliate. He could have called down legions of angels to destroy his enemies, but instead he prayed for their forgiveness. And in the greatest act of divine justice, God raised him from the dead, proving that his justice is always victorious. When we let go of our need for revenge and trust God's justice, we free ourselves from the burden of bitterness. Instead of being consumed by anger, we can walk in peace, knowing that God sees, He knows, and He will act in His perfect time. When faced with opposition, betrayal, or injustice, our natural response is often fear, anger, or self-defense. We want to react, to protect ourselves, to fight back. However, God calls us to respond not with fear, but with faith. Faith is the foundation of our relationship with God, and it is what allows us to trust that He is in control, even when circumstances seem overwhelming. Fear is the tool of the enemy. It clouds our judgment, weakens our resolve, and makes us act in ways that are outside of God's will. But faith, true faith, keeps us steady in the midst of trials, reminding us that we serve a God who is greater than any enemy we will ever face. One of the greatest biblical examples of responding with faith rather than fear is found in the story of Daniel. Daniel was a man of integrity, committed to God in a land where the rulers sought to destroy his faith. When a decree was passed that forbade prayer to anyone but the king, Daniel had a choice. He could submit out of fear and preserve his life, or he could remain faithful to God even if it meant facing death. He chose faith. He continued to pray openly, knowing that it would lead to his arrest. When he was thrown into the lion's den, Daniel did not panic. He did not plead for his life or try to escape. Instead, he trusted that God would handle the situation. And what happened? God shut the mouths of the lions, delivering Daniel from harm. His faith in God overpowered the fear of his enemies. Another example comes from the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 young men were ordered to bow down to a golden statue or face death in a fiery furnace. They could have given in to fear and justified their actions as self-preservation. But instead, they boldly declared their faith, saying, "The God we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace, and He will deliver us. But even if He does not, we will not serve your gods." Their faith was not dependent on whether God would save them. It was rooted in their unshakable trust in Him. And in response to their faith, God miraculously protected them. They walked through the fire unharmed, proving that faith has power over fear. Jesus also demonstrated this principle when He stood before Pilate. Though He was falsely accused and unjustly condemned, He did not respond in fear or anger. He did not argue or defend Himself. He stood in perfect peace, knowing that God's plan was unfolding exactly as it should. His faith in the Father's will was greater than the fear of suffering and death. When we respond with faith instead of fear, we allow God to work in ways we may not understand at the moment. We show that our trust is not in our own strength, but in His power. Fear causes us to act impulsively, to make decisions driven by emotion rather than wisdom. But faith keeps us grounded, reminding us that God is always in control. Even when enemies rise against us, even when circumstances seem impossible, faith tells us to stand firm and let God fight the battle. The world teaches us that power comes from domination, that strength is shown in retaliation, and that victory is achieved by defeating those who oppose us. But Jesus taught something radically different. He showed us that the greatest weapons a believer can use against their enemies are love and forgiveness. These are not signs of weakness, but of profound spiritual strength. To love and forgive those who hurt us is not natural, it is supernatural. It requires the power of God working within us. And when we choose this path, we are not just obeying Christ's commands. We are disarming the enemy in a way that no earthly force can. Jesus made it clear in Matthew 5:44 when He said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This is one of the hardest teachings in the Bible. Loving those who love us is easy. Forgiving those who apologize is expected. But loving those who insult us, praying for those who hurt us, and forgiving those who have no remorse, that takes divine strength. Yet this is exactly what Jesus did. As He hung on the cross after being falsely accused, beaten, mocked, and abandoned, He could have called down angels to destroy His enemies. Instead, He prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." His response changed history. His love and forgiveness were the very weapons that defeated sin and death, securing salvation for all who believe in Him. One of the most powerful examples of this principle is found in the story of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. In Acts 7, Stephen was falsely accused and dragged before the religious leaders. As he boldly preached the truth, his enemies became furious and stoned him to death. But in his final moments, Stephen did something incredible. He echoed the words of Jesus. As the stone struck his body, he cried out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." He did not curse his enemies. He did not pray for their destruction. He forgave them, and who was standing there watching? Saul of Tarsus, the very man who would later become Paul, the greatest missionary of all time. Stephen's act of love and forgiveness was a seed planted in Saul's heart, one that God would later use to transform him into a champion for Christ. Forgiveness is not just about setting the other person free, it is about setting ourselves free. When we hold on to bitterness, we give our enemies power over us. We allow their actions to control our emotions and dictate our peace. But when we forgive, we break those chains. We release the burden of anger and allow God to bring healing. Forgiveness does not mean that we excuse wrongdoing or that we allow injustice to continue. It means that we trust God to be the judge, to handle the situation in His perfect way. Love and forgiveness are not weaknesses, they are weapons of the Spirit. They have the power to break cycles of hatred, to transform hearts, and to bring about victories that revenge never could. When we choose to love our enemies, we reflect the very heart of God, and in doing so, we walk in the true strength of His kingdom. Patience is one of the most difficult virtues to develop, especially when we are facing opposition. When we are wronged, mistreated, or falsely accused, our natural instinct is to seek immediate justice. We want to see our enemies held accountable right away, but God operates on a different timeline. He is not in a hurry, and His justice is always carried out at the right time. Learning to trust in His timing requires patience and faith, but when we do, we experience a peace that surpasses all understanding. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of God's people waiting on His justice. One of the most powerful stories is that of Joseph. As a young man, Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and later falsely accused and imprisoned. He had every reason to feel abandoned and hopeless. Years passed, and it seemed like justice would never come. But Joseph did not lose faith. He remained patient and trusted that God was working behind the scenes. And in God's perfect timing, Joseph was elevated to the second highest position in Egypt, given authority over the very people who had wronged him. His story teaches us that God's justice is not always immediate, but it is always certain. David also had to learn the power of patience. He was anointed as the future king of Israel while he was still a young shepherd, but for years he was hunted by King Saul, who saw him as a threat and tried to kill him. David had multiple chances to take matters into his own hands and kill Saul, but he chose to wait on God. He refused to force his way onto the throne, trusting that God would bring justice in his own time. And in the end, God did. Saul fell in battle, and David became king, not by his own efforts, but by God's hand. The greatest example of waiting on God's justice is found in Jesus himself. When he was falsely accused, beaten, and sentenced to death, he did not retaliate. He did not call on his followers to fight back. Instead, he entrusted himself to the Father, knowing that God's justice would prevail. And it did. 3 days after his death, Jesus rose from the grave, proving that no injustice, no betrayal, and no act of evil could stand against the power of God. His resurrection is the ultimate reminder that God's justice is never late. It is always on time. When we face enemies, it is easy to become impatient, to wonder why God has not acted yet. But we must remember that his ways are higher than ours. He sees the full picture. Sometimes he allows delays to refine our character, to strengthen our faith, or to bring about an even greater victory than we could imagine. Our role is to trust him, to remain faithful, and to wait with confidence. Justice belongs to God, and when we rely on his timing, we will see his power revealed in ways we never expected. In this life, we will face enemies. We will encounter opposition, betrayal, and injustice. But as believers, we are not called to fight these battles in our own strength. God has shown us through his word that he is our defender, our protector, and our righteous judge. When we trust him to handle our enemies, we free ourselves from the burdens of anger, revenge, and fear. We have seen through the lives of Joseph, David, Daniel, and even Jesus himself that God's justice is sure. He calls us to respond not with hatred, but with faith, patience, love, and forgiveness. He reminds us that vengeance is his and that he will act in his perfect time. We do not need to waste our energy trying to fight battles that belong to him. Instead, we can stand firm, knowing that he sees every wrong, he hears every cry, and he will bring justice in ways far greater than we ever could. When we release our need for control and trust in God's plan, we walk in true peace. We do not need to be consumed by bitterness, fear, or resentment. Instead, we can rest in the assurance that God is always at work, even when we cannot see it. So today, let us choose to put our battles in God's hands. Let us trust his justice, respond with faith, and wait on his timing. Let us love, forgive, and walk in the confidence that no enemy can stand against the power of our Almighty God. Because when we let God handle our enemies, we are not just avoiding conflict, we are stepping into the victory that he has already prepared for us.